Hi everyone, my name is Essen and you're listening to the Brown History Podcast. The song you just heard was called Ever So Lonely by the band Monsoon, and the lead singer, Sheila Chandra, is our guest today. This song created waves in 1982 when it made it on the UK charts. The band ended up dissolving, but Sheila embarked on her own solo career and went on to release several albums. In 2002, she was actually in the Lord of the Rings The Two Towers movie soundtrack in the song Breath of Life, where she sings completely in Elvish. Sadly, in 2010, she developed a rare chronic condition called burning mouth syndrome, which made it very hard for her to speak. So it's really kind of her to come and talk to us today. It's a very special episode. We're very lucky to have this episode. So enough chit chat. Let's get this going. Here we go. It's really nice to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this. I understand that you have a medical issue that makes it really hard for you to talk. Do you want to discuss that?
Yeah, sure. I have. It started when I was had a car crash a very minor car crash in '92, and unfortunately, I had detached retinas, so I needed to have an emergency operation to save my sight, and because it was an emergency operation and they were rather hurried, they damaged one of my vocal cords when they were intubating me, which produced a permanent twist in my larynx due to the scarring.
Wow.
So I had a problem with that, and speech and singing were painful because it's a very serious issue for a very athletic vocalist to have. And then that probably primed my system for pain. So then in 2010, I developed burning mouth syndrome, which is neurological pain in my mouth when I speak. So I have the pain from the twist in the larynx in my throat and the pain from the neurological pain in my mouth. And it means that I have to ration the amount that I speak. So when I start speaking, it will start hurting. And then the more I speak, the bigger the pain gets and the longer lasting it is. So I only speak for a very limited amount of time per week. But I do need to speak because otherwise my vocal mechanism would atrophy and I'd sound very rusty. So, speech just has to be scheduled in.
So, which is why this is a really big deal that you're, going through all that just to talk to me. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And this situation is really profound because it asks the question, what do you do when what you do, you can't do anymore? Music has been your whole life. It's your medium for creativity and it's your number one thing. And all of a sudden you're stopped from doing that. It's like, what would happen to Michelangelo if he can't paint? What would happen to Stephen King if he can't write anymore? So I want to know what that is like, that you're not able to do what you do.
Well, in a word, it's frustrating. And there is a big grief process. But for singers, it's also an identity problem because people identify you with your voice and what you can do. In a way, the skill you have as a singer is what people want you for. Mm-hmm. And it becomes such an identity thing. You almost don't know who you are if you can't sing, if you're not a singer. So there's a whole remaking process of identity that one needs to go through. Who am I if I'm not a singer? I mean, who would Michelangelo be without a painter? The minute we say Michelangelo, we say painter, sculptor. Those are the two words that follow his name. So it's a similar problem. And in my case, I had been writing a journal for a long time, just for my own, mental health, as it were, good mental health. And writing became my new voice. So it became, I needed to find a new purpose and a way of expressing myself, and writing became that. So I became a non-fiction author in 2010. And I also now coach artists from around the world via video call. So
wow.
Because I didn't want what I knew to go to waste.
Right.
And usually when you have coaches, they're not professional artists themselves. They haven't worked at all, lots of levels in the industry. For someone who had a hit when they were 16, I've been there. I've been in those meetings with the majors, and I've also worked on independent labels by choice and not really singles by choice. So, I have the experience of the kinds of creative and business problems that a lot of artists face. And I didn't want that to go to waste. So, my loss can be someone else's gain. I'm not too busy sustaining an artistic career.
Right.
So that means I have time to coach people.
But you started really, really young in the arts. Right at, I mean, I want to go even more back and wanted to know, because it's very hard to find someone who's been in the artist industry from the generation that came to England from, I think, the 70s, 60s, 80s. So I want to know how your family ended up in England.
Well, I had unconventional grandparents in that my grandmother, although she was born in India, she was white. And I don't know much about the family history on her side before that. So I'm not sure if it was her parents who had emigrated or even further back than that. But she and my grandfather, and he was fairly high caste, not a Brahmin, but fairly high caste Hindu. They met, and she was, I think she was married or divorced. She had 3 children by her first husband already. And they fell in love in the 20s.
Wow.
Which in South India was a big deal.
Yeah, for sure.
And
talk of the town.
Yeah, absolutely. You could imagine the ructions. Anyway, so I'm 3/4 Indian, and there was always this link back to England because there was the sort of biological link. And when, I'm not sure all your listeners will necessarily know this, but at that time, Commonwealth citizens, even after independence in 47, Commonwealth citizens had a free right of entry to the UK. And that was about to be changed in 62. They were going to restrict entry from Commonwealth, immigration from Commonwealth countries. And at that point, my family decided, well, we need to get our act together if any of us want to go to England then. So my mother came over in 62, just before the act came in. And then my father followed her, and then they got married. And so my sister and I were born in England.
What was that? What was it like being raised in England in the 60s, 70s? Because the 60s were really, you had National Front, you had racism on a high, protests happening. I mean, it was vicious. And then the 70s weren't that easy either. So what was it like for you to, and you look Indian, so you are a target for any racist attacks out there. So what is it like for you to grow up in the 60s, 70s?
Yeah, it was the bad old 60s and 70s. I think particularly in the 70s, as the economic problems, Britain became what they call the sick man of Europe. And I think when things are going wrong economically in wider society, then you tend to get more scapegoating, as we've had post-Brexit, of minority groups.
Right.
So I remember this. I mean, of course, I only was old enough to remember the 70s, but you had National Front activity, you had fear of going out alone, and if you were a big group, you didn't tend to go out alone. The kind of what I call that kind of unconscious veiling of hostility, where you go into a shop and people treat you politely, but there's kind of nothing behind the eyes, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think the psychological impact of that is that ideally, when you grow up, when you're very young, what you want is a family that embraces you emotionally and makes you feel that the world is an okay, safe place. When you can feel from your friends and neighbors, well, not friends, obviously, but from neighbors, and that the world is not a safe place, it does impact your self-image. It does impact you psychologically in a way that I think therapists in the West don't necessarily acknowledge. It's ironic. You can go to a therapist, and if you've suffered any sort of abuse or trauma in your family, then all families have, a bereavement or someone with a chronic illness or so.
Right.
As kids, we've all been through something, and they'll painstakingly spend 30 sessions picking through that with you. But when you mentioned that, the National Front were parading not far away and you were being called a Paki by neighbours, that kind of trauma is like not important. We don't spend 30 sessions unpicking that. And we don't talk about how that impacted the formation of your character when you were only 5 years old.
Right.
And that's totally crazy.
Especially at that time.
especially at that time, exactly, we're supposed to completely have gotten over it because racism is over now, isn't it? And this is, people thinking that racism is over if you aren't being beaten up in the street. So, things, even that level of awareness has changed in the last 10 years. But, further on, when you're trying to deal with the consequences of growing up in the 70s, even then you come up against the next barrier, which is the sort of lack of understanding in the people who should be supporting you. How else was it? I think in the media was the other big impact, because the British media, mainstream media, spent most of its time discussing the Asian community as a social problem. It was very biased coverage. It was all about how we wouldn't integrate. And it was all about how, it was a problem having a community with such a strong cultural identity. I think they had less of a problem with the Black community in the sense that because of slavery, that sort of pride about one's history and knowledge of one's history and one's language, one's culture and one's religion is it's a more unbroken line from India than you get with people who've migrated from the Caribbean. Yes, they've got Caribbean culture, but they're maybe disconnected from the West African roots, the Kingdom of Benin, the huge sort of history of African empires and African spirituality. So anyway, we were getting a lot of negative press. And this was the era where no Asian newsreaders, no Asian radio present, well, hardly any, except unless they were specialist radio programs, no Asian mainstream radio presenters. And chicken tikka masala in the UK supermarket, or chicken tikka masala being regarded as a sort of national dish, which if you're from the UK, you will know how ubiquitous that was. There was none of that. You did not see people of colour on washing adverts. There was an unofficial exclusion policy because brown skin was associated with dirt. I mean, that's how far back we're going.
Wow. So
makeup ads. I mean, you never saw someone with an olive skin. It was English roses all the way.
Yikes.
There was just no one to aspire to. You couldn't get makeup for olive skin unless it was in various specialist shops. You had to use all this pink pancake powder stuff and, that powder blue eyeshadow.
Yeah.
This is the era. I mean, the level of exclusion and the level of othering and the level of subtle propaganda against, because of all this sort of Eurosocial problem stuff. And then I think the only positive carryover was the trips that the Beatles had made to India in the 60s. But that was very much dissociated from the Asian diaspora in the UK.
Right.
So when I was 16 and I was head of fronting this Asian fusion band called Monsoon, and we had this top 10 global hit called Ever So Lonely, which was basically it was written on Raga Jog, and it was basically Indian classical raga with piano and crash beats. Crash beats were very trendy at the time, and tabla and Jaws harp and Chinese gong. And it was set in this sea of synth pop, because synths had just become democratized. And everybody was using them, and it was the sound, and there'd been this great leap forward of technology. And suddenly there was this acoustic sound that was not like nothing else. And it was 5 years before the term world music was invented. And so for me to be on top of the pops in a purple silk sari with a tilak on my head, it's very obviously Asian sound. Yeah. This was like, it was that first positive representation we were looking for. And suddenly for a little while there, we were cool.
But here's a very interesting thing here. Before you started your music career, you were an actress, and you were on this show. I'm not from the UK, but apparently it's a show that's been going on for like 30 years, and it's called Grunge Hill, if I'm pronouncing it right.
It's called Grange Hill.
Grange Hill, sorry. And here you are discussing how hard it was to grow up in this kind of society and the trauma that it can bring to a young girl. It can make you feel worthless or less than, and it can make you feel scared and insecure, and there's no one to look up to. Where did you get the guts to put yourself in camera at age 14? Because I think you were the only South Asian girl in that show, or one of the only ones, and you're only 14 and you put yourself in front of everybody to look at and to judge you. So I was curious to know, like, how did you come up with the courage to just put yourself out there?
Well, it was by a fluke of fate, really, that I went to a theatre arts school called the Italia Conti Academy. And a theatre arts school is in England anyway, is where you do 3 hours a day of arts subjects like ballet and tap and modern dance and acting and so on. And then 3 hours a day of academic subjects that you would expect at high school. And the reason I got there was because I was a really skinny youngster and I wouldn't eat. I was one of those typical, really, really skinny Asian kids. And my mum, I was not getting any exercise because I was not getting outside because of the danger. Mm-hmm. And so my mum sent me to a local, a little dance school that did ballet and tap and things. And then I was at primary school. I was really, really lazy. And they just couldn't get me to work. And there was this private school, theatre arts school, that wasn't far away. And it was a bribe, really. My mum said, okay, you like these subjects, you can do them for 3 hours a day, and we'll get you a scholarship to go. But the only way you can keep your scholarship is if you're really good with your academic subjects. So that was the bribe. And that school had an agency where they found work for child actors. And of course, when the BBC was scouting for Grange Hill, they came round and auditioned at our school as well as Anna Shear and all the other stage schools in London at the time. So I was an extreme introvert, and I didn't really think of putting myself out there, but kind of by a fluke, I auditioned and I got it.
Wow. How did you, for an extreme introvert, how did you handle all that collaboration and being on set and dealing with people?
Not particularly well. Not particularly well. I mean, these are kids that burst into song as soon as the camera's off and are doing time steps, and all you have to do is yell 5, 6, 7, 8, and they'll all do something. And that old vaudeville joke of when you get up in the middle of the night and you open the fridge and the light comes on, you do 5 minutes, that kind of personality. And I just kept myself to myself. And I found that quite difficult as an introvert to be around all those extreme extroverts all the time. But it did keep me focused on my academic work. And the nice thing about Grange Hill was, although it was a children's drama, it was gritty and groundbreaking, especially in those days, because what you'd had up to the 70s was a depiction in children's stories of upper class children at private schools. So you had all that sort of Billy Bunter, Just William, all those sort of 50s stories of kids in uniform, speaking with a posh accent, mm-hmm. who are jolly good sorts, those sorts of jolly hockey sticks kind of kids. And the thing about Grange Hill was it was shocking, and some parents banned their kids from watching it because it was working class kids facing things like dyslexia, shoplifting. Later on, they tackled drugs, all sorts of gritty stuff. So, nice project to be part of from that point of view.
So how did you go from that to your music career?
Well, the agency again. It was discovered that I could sing. My voice broke when I was 14, and it was discovered that I could sing. And so I was sent for an audition with Hansa Records, who at that time had Boney M. So, I mean, Boney M were absolutely massive and sold squillions of records. And Hansa were looking to put together an early boy-girl band of 14 to 18-year-olds, which actually legally is quite difficult because there are all sorts of restrictions on how kids up to 16 how long they can work and when they can work and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
which is why you tend to get boy and girl bands now with people over 16. Obviously, it's much, much easier. But anyway, they had this idea to put that together. And they had me do some demo tapes. Nothing came of that project, but Steve Coe, who was the writer behind Monsoon, who had been listening to his neighbours' Hindi film records from the golden era, from the 60s, that were all folk and classical influenced. He found that influence coming out in his writing, wanted to put a band together, thought I probably will have to get the Asian personnel from the sort of sitar and tabla side, was looking for a singer, happened to know the receptionist at Hansa Records. 2 years later, he's up there saying, "Who have you got?" And she just pulled out an old demo box, and there was a demo there was my demo still in there.
Wow, another fluke.
Yeah, absolute fluke. So he plays the demo. He's only heard my voice at this point. He goes, "That is the voice of Monsoon," and says to her, "Can I see a photo?" She pulls a photo from the file. I'm Asian. So he found probably the only Asian singer of the right age in the UK with TV experience at that time. It's just one of those synchronicity things.
And it's very impressive that this was all done at like when you were age 16 and you made it to the charts. Was it rough for to get a major record studio to sign up with you guys, because you're not only are you don't look like anybody else, but at the same time your music is very different than what was happening at that time. I think 1982 Eye of the Tiger came out.
1983 Eye of the Tiger, yeah, but yeah, it's that era. It's
That
OMD,
vibe.
it's Duran Duran, it's Spandau Ballet, battle of those two at the top of the charts. Yes, so as I've said, it was a sea of synth, and we made a 4-track EP in 81 and sent it to record companies, and no one was interested at all. And but again, we were lucky. There was this guy at Phonogram who had just started a small label which was focused on featuring music of the Far East, because he'd been traveling in the Far East and had heard all these interesting bands. And by chance, his logo had that sort of picture of that section of the world on it, and happened to include India. And when this demo came in, the A&I guy there, Dave Bates, said, "Why don't you consider this band as well? Because it's kind of in your area. It's Asia, even if it's near Asia rather than the Far East." And so we kind of got in through the back door, through this specialist label. And Dave Bates was great because he secretly, gave us his demo budget for the year, sent us down to Rockfield to record, and we spent it all on the A side, on Ever So Lonely. And we came back with a sound where, you know, the minute people heard it, they'd switch off the tape and say, "Okay, what do you want?"
When that song came out, like it was a hit. Ever So Lonely, it hit the charts.
Well, it wasn't a hit in America because America is very album orientated. So anywhere where there was singles orientated, yes.
In the UK, it was a hit, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to know how the South Asian community responded to you, because you're wearing, in the music video, you're wearing a sari. There's camels. There's sand.
Oh, you're thinking of the German TV appearance we did. That isn't a video.
That's
not a video. That's TV appearance from German TV.
Appearance. Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
And they brought in camels. And you know that whole sand dune set? It's made of sandpaper, and I was barefoot, so I was spinning bare sandpaper.
You know, you're out there now, and people are recognizing you and seeing your face there. How did the South Asian community respond to you at that time? I mean, it must be a big deal, I guess, at the time to see you up there.
It was, and I think, and that was partly good and partly bad, because I'm at the older edge of the second generation. So I'm 16, a lot of the second generation much younger than me. And they didn't necessarily have a voice that I would get to hear. I didn't get any of my fan mail from Phonogram, unfortunately. So I didn't get the kind of personal reaction you would get these days from social media, where it's very much more easy for people to tell you what they think of your work and whether they've liked it or not. What you did get was this, there was in some quarters quite a trepidatious reaction from the older generation, who felt that I was diluting the culture. And,
older South Asian community, you're saying?
Absolutely. First
Okay.
generation are like, we have this fantastic classical tradition with all these rules and you have just broken them, and they're like, what is this?
Oh my God.
They hadn't, a younger generation, the second generation, weren't old enough yet for them to have realized that culture has to remain living and it has to become part of its context. It has to take its context into account, and it has to put down new roots.
Right.
And that what Monsoon were doing was very, very healthy. It was a way of making sure that there was a path back to Indian classical music, because there's a moment, and you've got to remember this is 5 years before world music, and the song broke in the UK gay clubs. These were mainstream clubs that were playing it, and at first, the record was so different, it would clear the floor. And then once people got used to the sound, it would pack the floor, consistently pack the floor. So you've got mainstream clubs, people who really know nothing about their Asian neighbours. And when the Ever So Lonely 12-inch is really well constructed, it's not one of those songs that's constructed as a 7-inch and then extended out into a 12-inch. It was constructed as a 12-inch and then edited down to a 7-inch. So there's this moment in the instrumental of the 12-inch. You've been dancing along, you've got this really catchy ever so low, 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 and great. Everybody sings that because it's so simple. And it's almost like a mantra. And then you get the middle eight, then you get the instrumental break. And what happens in an instrumental break? You start pulling out some of the instruments, don't you? And then you build it back up to the end choruses. That's what you do. So everything gets pulled out: the piano, the bass, everything gets pulled out until what you're dancing to is sitar, tabla, Jaws harp, and a little bit of Chinese gong. You are dancing to a classical raga. Everybody is dancing to a classical raga with this song they love. And the most important thing is it was their own. This is my song, this is my music, this expresses what I feel. The big difference since world music is there's been a kind of, there's been a structural apartheid in the sense that if you're a world music act, your sales don't count towards the mainstream charts. If you outsell Madonna for a day, assuming you were that lucky, nobody would ever know because they're not being counted for the same chart. You get interviewed on different programs, you get reviewed in different magazines. So there's this structural apartheid, but there's also what comes with that is a psychological apartheid. This music is other than me. This is not the music that speaks my heart. And you kind of had that with the blues in, up to the 30s and 40s. And then post rock and roll, suddenly black music becomes everyone's music. No one listens to Beyonce and says, that's black music. Everyone says, that's a great tune. That expresses what I feel. And we have yet to make that leap, and I don't know if we ever will, because we've set up a huge structural barrier now that kind of others certain sounds.
It sounds like you were ahead of your time. And
for this year marks 40 years since Ever So Lonely was a hit, and Cherry Red have just put together a deluxe package, including some 6 unreleased tracks that have never been heard before. They're re-releasing the Monsoon album Third Eye on the 25th of November.
Wow!
And the first orders, you get a signed postcard as well, and it's a really nice little package. The thing about the Monsoon tracks are because we were surrounded by, the sea of synth pop. When you get those golden oldie programs that look back 40 years and play the hits, they tend to play the typical hits. They don't tend to play Ever So Lonely because it sticks out like a sore thumb in a way. It isn't of the time. It isn't, and it was a single hit. It's not like we had a string of hits. So, and the Monsoon album has not been available on CD for a long time. It's been very hard to find, even if you want to stream it. So now it will get that little blip of, that little bump of recognition 40 years on.
How'd your parents take you going into music? Because you just mentioned that you were from it was a conservative society. So how did your parents deal with that?
I think they were okay while they understood me being famous when I was sort of splashed on the front cover of Sounds and NME and being interviewed on mainstream TV, they didn't like the idea of, once I gave that up, because Monsoon broke up because our second single didn't do so well, our third single bombed, and the album was only released after the band disbanded. The record company threw the contract at us and said, drop the Indian influence. And we said, no. And, I think in those days, and still to some degree, people see other cultures as something that you put on like a costume and then you take off. Or like a curry sauce in a jar, and then you go back to normal cooking. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
I couldn't understand why they didn't see that we had thousands of years of music and culture to explore as a band. And they're saying, like, we've done it, drop it. And you've got Simple Minds whose image is wearing Macs, and you call that deep, you ignore 4,000 years of culture. So I decided I didn't want to work with a major again.
Wow.
Because I didn't want to be pushed around. Right. And I knew that when you play the singles game, you can understand it. The singles game is a very, very expensive game. Right. You can spend 100,000 on a video. In those days, you could spend 50,000 on an album, and, that would have bought you 3 houses, not in London, but, it would have bought you 3 UK houses. So when a company spends that much money on you, they feel entitled to direct you because they want their money back. They want to make their money back. So I decided I wasn't going to play the singles game because it was too expensive, and it would dictate how I explored this field, which I was really, really excited about. And I think my family were less comfortable with me being a singer when there was no glory attached to it. And I think that was the respectability factor, because it's very hard to criticize someone's daughter for being a singer when they're on top of the pops. Right. You can say, oh, she's a singer, that's terrible. Because, being in the arts is terrible. Being a singer or a dancer or an actress is terrible for your reputation. But, then your parent can come back with, well, she's all over TV and she's famous and you're just jealous, kind of thing. Right. But if you're a very obscure singer making very unmainstream sounds on an independent label and not receiving mainstream attention as a result, that is much harder to justify and fight.
But you had success. Like, it wasn't as if you weren't successful. You've had success, so shouldn't that should kind of spill over to your solo career? I would assume.
You can say that, but it didn't.
Okay, so now you're alone basically in your solo career. You don't have much support from the community or your family, and you don't have a band anymore.
Well, I never had much support from the community. I mean, partly it's because there was this reservation from the older generation, but it's also because I'm not one of the big demographics here in the UK. I'm not Punjabi or Gujarati. I'm not Hindu or Muslim. I'm not Sikh. The South Indian community is very, very small. Mm-hmm. There was some sectarianism, especially in the late 80s.
Wow. How was life as a solo artist? I think you released 5 albums.
Yep. I was so I didn't want to play live because I didn't want to play the same song 20 or 30 times when I could be doing more experiments in the studio. So I made 4 solo albums in 2 years, and I was too busy learning my job and developing as an artist to worry too much about the lack of support from India, who looked down their nose at the music making in the diaspora in those days, or from communities in the UK. I had enough of an audience because I kind of cashed in my fame chips, as it were. I had enough of an audience because of the hit with Monsoon to sell enough records to keep going. And that was all that mattered to me. I was still living with my family, so that was possible to do. And I started to write songs at the age of 19 with my second solo album, Quiet, which was an album of 10 lyricless soundscapes using voices and instruments, so voice layered up with various techniques. So it sort of influence, the second, if you put a pen in a vocalist's hand, what you get is loads of vocals. So it's quite obvious, really, the influence there. And I was just too busy to notice in many ways. There was just so much to learn, and so much. I didn't understand the recording process. I needed to learn about that. I needed to learn what was possible. I needed to learn what my voice was capable of. And I needed to explore all these amazing techniques and styles, which were suddenly accessible to me. I had a sabbatical between 85 and 1991.
Why? What was the reason for the break?
Well, the situation with my family had become untenable, and I left and had no contact with anyone I'd known. I married Steve Coe, and we moved up north. Steve Coe was a founder member of Monsoon.
Yes.
And I had a sabbatical so that I could explore vocal technique in more depth and kind of recover from, because at that point I'd been working since I was 12 years old on Grange Hill,
right,
up to the age of 20. I'd been in the charts. I'd recorded 4 albums in 2 years. I kind of needed a bit of a break.
And then what happened when the break was over?
I came back with Roots and Wings in 91, got fed up with working with very tiny independent labels because they kept going bankrupt on us, and then went to Real World, Peter Gabriel's label, and made a trilogy for Real World in the 90s.
How was he like? How was the relationship between you and him?
Oh, he doesn't get involved in the day-to-day stuff. I mean, it's not like artists going in and saying, "Where are my royalties?" and banging the desk.
Right.
It's not like that. He has business manager and label managers and label A&R and all those people who do those jobs because he's busy doing his creative stuff. So,
right.
I think Real World at that time were very African artist heavy. I mean, they were one of the official world music labels, and they had a huge reputation for high quality recordings because they had Real World studios. And they used to, put artists in there to record. And that was one reason to go to them. I noticed they had a very male-heavy roster and a very African-heavy roster. So I thought, well, what you need is a South Asian woman.
Wow.
And I want to make some really high-quality recordings, and I can structure the deal so that I can do that. They also had a very artist-friendly reputation, and in fact I signed all 3 albums to them unheard and before they were mixed, and they signed, they were happy to sign on those albums because they trusted me. And they're all solo voice albums, so they're quite challenging.
At the same time, throughout the decades in the UK, there were a lot of South Asian musicians emerging. There was MC Punjabi, there was Jay Sean, there was a lot like that. Did you ever come together and kind of, I guess, collaborate, or maybe not even collaborate, but just kind of meet up and just complain about stuff?
Not a huge amount. Because there tends to be an Asian festival circuit and a world music circuit, and I was more on the world music circuit. I did meet up with Joy and talk to them about collaborating, although nothing sort of came of that. And they later signed to Real World, so they were more on that world music side. And then Asian Underground was late 90s, so that because of Asian clubs and things growing up in the early 90s. So
you had Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, I think, who collaborated with Peter Gabriel also. Did you meet him? Yeah,
I did meet him. I'd met him at the WOMAD Yokohama in 1992.
Wow.
We just had a little chat, but
that's iconic.
Amazing singer, absolutely amazing. But I think his collaborations with Michael Brook were perfect. I don't think I would have been a great collaborator for him. You want someone that balances you out, that offers a different set of techniques or skills or what have you. So coming from this sort of the same tradition as him, I think he was better off working with Michael Brook. So I wanted to play live for the first time. I'd been a very shy studio artist, and in 92 I thought, well, now I have to crack this. Now I have to.
Wait, so you didn't have a concert? You released your song in 82, 83, and you didn't perform live in front of an audience until 92?
We had one concert at the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan in South Kensington in London in 1981, but that was really an excuse to get the band together to rehearse.
Okay.
We did 20 minutes for the Independence Day concert. They had there in front of an audience of about 300. But we weren't, in those days, because synths had come in and people were working on a very highly electronic sound, the concept of the studio band was very popular. The idea of a band that only came together in the studio and never toured was, it was fine. It was a legitimate concept.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd remained a studio artist until 92. And I didn't really want to get into the logistics of learning how to tour with musicians and set all that up and learn all the technical stuff at the same time. And because most artists at the level I was then would have loads of live experience in very low risk circumstances.
I see.
They have all that experience to bring with them. Whereas if you're the lead singer of Monsoon as was, and then you've got this album out on Real World, and and then you go and do a bad gig because you've never done a gig before, the stakes are quite different. And I thought, okay, well, I don't want all that complication, and moreover, I want to learn about stagecraft without anyone else to hide behind. So I decided that my first live performances as a solo artist, and really ever, would be me alone on stage, either completely unaccompanied or with a drone. And this presented me with a huge technical problem because by roots and wings, I was layering up, 27 tracks of vocal in various different techniques that would all sort of weave over and under each other. And you can't take 27 of me on stage, or 23 of me on stage.
No.
I don't mean 27, I mean 23, because that's how you get 24 tracks on a 2-inch piece of tape. So you can't layer a singer up, and I didn't want to be one of those artists that sort of press the button and loads of stuff happens and then they just sing a little bit on top.
Yeah. You wanted it to be perfect and
true.
I
wanted it to be real. Yeah, I wanted to be real. I didn't want to disappoint people. And also the quite amusing, because I hadn't played live for the first 10 years of my career, the word had gone around the music business that I couldn't sing.
Oh, so you're a fake, basically.
Yeah, but it was all constructed in the studio.
Right. Milli Vanilli.
And this was why I never, ever played live, because I couldn't actually sing. So I thought, okay, I'll go on stage alone. And I had to... Sorry,
go ahead. I just want to say that you were there to prove people wrong, basically.
Well, yeah, I had to win them over. And to do that, to be able to go on stage alone, it's one thing to juxtapose phrases. You could sing a sort of slightly Vedic phrase, and then you could sing, a slightly English folk phrase, and you could find a way of putting them together. But I was more ambitious than that. I wanted to find the gateways in the voice, because the voice is the instrument we've had all through time. We know it's the instrument whose construction has not changed for modern humans. So the sounds that our ancestors of 100 generations ago made are the same sounds that we are capable of making. We have the same instrument, allowing for individual variations. Obviously, some of us can sing and some of us can't. But so, it also follows that 500 years ago, a musician in Asia and a musician in England could be making the same vocal sounds. And I wanted to find the gateways between those vocal techniques. So I had to find a way of being able to turn on a dime, really, to be able to go from, blues vocal into folk vocal without taking a breath, to be able to go from a 900-year-old Irish song into Arabic sounding vocal without taking a breath.
Wow.
And that's what the trilogy does, especially the first two albums, Weaving My Ancestors' Voices and The Zen Kiss.
That's wild. Again, that's impressive.
No one wanted to make music like that. I mean, very few singers will make a solo voice album because you're totally exposed. And I didn't want it to be boring, so we spent 16 hours on treating the vocal on every single track. Most bands, certainly at that time, will get into the studio for 5 days, say, to record a single. They'll spend the first day putting down the drums, and then they'll spend days on the guitars and all that sort of stuff. And then they'll have about 2 hours left for the vocal. And the same with the mix. They'll hurriedly put the vocal on the top because it's the last thing to go on. And I know that Weaving My Ancestors' Voices set a new technical standard in the industry because people, even in the most expensive studios, had simply not bothered to use all that equipment on the voice and are not bothered to spend that much time on it. So technically, in terms of technology, it was also a leap forward.
How was the performance in the end?
Yeah, I think so. People reacted very well. Audiences were
How did you feel?
I felt good. I wasn't a natural performer. I was a more shy studio artist, but singing that material was extremely satisfying until I started to have voice problems because of the car crash that I was in, having my vocal cords nicked by the way I was intubated. And then I developed horrible stage fright because it's one thing to stand up there and sing a song nobody knows that's quite easy with a band behind you. Mm-hmm. If you're giving solo voice performances that people have heard on record and are incredibly virtuoso, and you don't know what your voice is going to do, that is terrifying.
Yeah.
And it took me a good 8-10 years to get over the stage fright. So there's another little gap there.
Wow. It's almost as if you restarted your first phase of your career.
In a way, yeah.
In a way, yeah. How come you didn't do any more acting gigs? Was acting not something you wanted to do anymore on the side?
I didn't act after the age of 16 when I came out of Grange Hill. There are lots of rules that protect you as an actress until you're 16, in England anyway.
Right.
And of course, you don't have the protection of those rules. And acting was never my thing, really. It was something that the agency got me into, and I was kind of obliged to say yes to almost. Singing was always my big passion.
How did Lord of the Rings come about?
One of the technicians, and I wish I could remember his name, it's very rude of me not to, gave Howard Shaw a copy of Moonsong, which is a kind of best of my Real World trilogy. Howard Shaw is an amazing film composer. I mean, he did the score for Mrs. Doubtfire and on. I mean, just loads and loads of really, really big films you'll have heard of. And he was doing the soundtrack for the Lord of the Rings films. They were on the Two Towers. And New Line's lawyers from New York just called me up and said, Howard has written this piece for your voice, which was incredible. Mm-hmm. Because my voice doesn't sit in, it's a contralto voice. It's quite a low voice for a female voice. So, I'm not Marnie Nixon, who would go and sing all those quite high operatic type vocals that you get from the 50s. I'm the kind of, if I was an actress, I'm the kind of actress you'd dub because I have this lower voice. But he had listened to Moonsong and discovered that on certain notes, I hit certain timbres and frequencies, which he liked, and he'd written the melody around those notes. So that was an incredible thing to be able to sing. And of course, I'd sung with drones for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And to go into the studio and sing this melody crafted for you with a whole orchestra changing chords underneath, it's like, I used to say it's like the difference between being in a tiny boat on a still pond and then suddenly being in that boat on a swelling ocean, that the waves of emotion just swell under you. Because the thing about drone is, Indian classical music, the onus is all on the singer or the instrumentalist. There's no chord change underneath to give emotional color to the melody. You're not being helped out by a key change. Do you know what I mean? Like when Whitney Houston goes, and that next key change up. Part of the emotion comes from, she's a great vocalist, but part of it comes from the key change, from all the instruments underneath, giving her another emotional color. And you don't get that in Indian classical music. There is nothing but the drones, single note or a note with a fifth above it. All the emotional content of the melody has to come from the inventiveness of the singer. That's the challenging thing about unaccompanied singing or singing with a drone. So, I was used to having to do all the heavy lifting emotionally myself. So suddenly there comes Howard Shaw, this amazingly beautiful, complex, quite dark. He wasn't afraid to be dark. It's great. It wasn't saccharine. Arrangement under this vocal line. And I get to sing it. Great. It was wonderful.
When you talk about music, it's so technical and it's very complex. I wonder what you think of the music in this generation now, which isn't really that deep and complex. It's very technological and has autotune and whatnot. How do you feel about music now?
There are still marvelous musicians who make my jaw drop, but you haven't necessarily heard of them.
Okay.
And I think the problem is that music has almost had algorithms applied to it so that it becomes constructed. And sometimes I find it's like being tickled too hard and no one's stopping. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's beautifully said.
There's kind of no, every chorus just takes you to that next level, and every middle eight takes you. It's so perfectly crafted, and I suspect it has been crafted with the use of algorithms. I know there is a very, very expensive Apple. There was at least 10 years ago, where it had taken in something like 10,000 mega hit tunes and could tell you what was wrong with the construction of your song if you played a new song, and make suggestions as to what you should do with those chord structures. So, yeah, I think it can be over-engineered, and I think that's because music revenues have come down since we've sold less physical product and the stakes have got higher, but promoting artists has not got any cheaper. So yeah, I do find that frustrating, but there is no limit to musical talent. There is no limit to artistry, and there'll be people doing things I don't understand, and there'll be people doing that are nevertheless extremely accomplished, and there'll be people who are talented but who are kind of being forced through that squash sausage machine. It's the only way they can really make a career. So even people who do have music that sounds very auto-tuned and over-engineered, I don't think, oh, you're an inferior musician, because I don't really know what they're capable of. That's the point. They've been wrapped in a sausage skin.
I love the tickling metaphor. I'm going to use that. After you were diagnosed with burning mouth syndrome and you really couldn't sing anymore, you started writing a lot of self-help books, as you said earlier. What is that like now? And what kind of what kind of self-help books are you writing? And to jump maybe on a follow-up question also, what advice can you give to young South Asian people who are trying to get into the artists in the music scene by themselves? It's
hard, and I think there are less pure financial incentives now than there were. It made a lot more sense to be a musician in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s. I think it's a whole different ball game, and I'm not sure I completely understand it. I'm not sure anyone completely understands it, to be honest.
All right.
I sometimes say, if I had my voice back tomorrow, well, that would be all well and good, but in a way, what kind of music business would there be for me to go back to? I think what's happened is that you used to have three levels of artists, and if I may, you sort of had your white bread sales in the millions at the top. You had your home bakers making sourdough starters at home. They're your band in a garage before they worked their way up. And you, in the middle, you had this. You had the artisan bakers. You had the ones that maybe made more expensive loaves of bread, but kind of moving the craft on. And you could also think of it in terms of the rainforest. You have loads of useless, in inverted commas, rainforest, which you don't have, which isn't commercialized. But actually, those people are the seed sowers. They're the people who break the musical ground for the next generation, who keep things interesting, who move music on. And that the artisan bakers have kind of been stripped out because it's very difficult for them to survive. It would be very difficult for me to survive as someone who doesn't want to release singles and doesn't want to be overtly commercial now. So that's a great shame, because I think, in a way, we had a slow food movement here 20 years ago where we recognized the value of, making all those traditional artisan cheeses the slow way. Even though they were a bit more expensive, because we didn't want to lose those traditions. And in a way, I think we need to rediscover that artisan class of musician again and make it viable for them to exist.
We're almost out of time. What are you working on these days? And can you tell us more about this relaunch of your music?
Well, the 40th anniversary of Ever So Lonely, there is this deluxe reissue on the 25th of November from Cherry Red. It's got new sleeve notes. It's got the only radio session tracks from Monsoon, so the closest you'll ever hear to Monsoon playing live. We did a session for Capital Radio back in '82. 2 albums, the 2 tracks that never made it onto the album, so that's interesting as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll be busy with that. But also, it's also 30 years this year since my first release with Real World. So we're a little bit behind, but they're reissuing my 3 albums next May. Wow. So I'm deep in, putting together the artwork with them for that, and doing the sort of general prep, and talking about the state of the industry then and now.
And if someone wants to read your books, how will they get access to
Amazon? Is the easiest place, or support your local independent
bookstores.
Go to SheilaChandra.com, and you'll find all aspects of my career there, including links through to the books, and a proper discography and stuff like that.
Awesome. This was lovely. It was very delightful. Thank you so much for doing this. I know it takes a lot, but this was amazing. It was like,
that's okay. I hope I wasn't too technical for you.
No, it was really good.
I kind of assumed you were interested, but
I was, but it's a lot. It was really well. The history lesson, I love the history, and I love the